You're listening to Searching for More, a podcast of the Diocese of Arlington. On this episode, Bridget Wilson, Program Director for the Catholic Diocese of Arlington's Multicultural Ministries, talks about her family's experience with adoption. Bridget comes from a family of 14, 12 kids ranging from ages 10 to 34 years old. 9 of the 12 children are adopted.
Not one single case did my parents actively go search to adopt a child. It was literally, starting out maybe just offering to foster children or someone bringing a child to your door, like baby on the doorstep type deal.
Hear Bridget's inspiring story of her family saying yes to God time and again. I'm Zoe Murray, staff writer with the Arlington Catholic Herald, and I'm your host for this episode. Thanks for being with us, Bridget.
Thanks for having me today.
So, your family story is really unique. You have 11 brothers and sisters. 9 of them are adopted, and many are from overseas and from your time overseas, your family's time overseas. Can you start the story kind of talking a little bit about your parents and then how this all began?
Sure. So my parents, they met, they had kind of fallen away from the church a little bit. They got married, had 3 kids, but my mom was always super active in pro-life ministry, and through that, she ended up coming back into the church. And when that happened, my mom was really praying about it and decided that she and my dad would want to foster some kids. So they ended up bringing home Stephanie and Mary, 2 little kids. Mary was a few months old. Stephanie was about 2 years old. And eventually, through a number of things that happened, Stephanie and Mary became available to adopt. My parents said yes. We all loved them so much. They were part of our family. And then after that, my dad, who was working for the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement, he got a job offer in Thailand, and so we moved over there. And that's where the majority of my siblings ended up being adopted. So.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about your time in Thailand and your siblings from
Sure. So when we moved there, I was probably about 5 or 6 years old. I was starting out in kindergarten. And again, just my parents, have always been super giving and super active. So they moved there with 5 of us at this point. And my mom started volunteering at this orphanage called the Agape Home, which was for children who were victims of HIV/AIDS. Either they had it or their parents had died from it, or any number of connections. Mm-hmm. And she'd been volunteering there for a couple weeks. And one day, a woman just put a baby in her arms and said, "Here, change Anawat." Mm-hmm. And that very second, my mom knew that she was bringing Anawat home with her that day, which is just so funny because she didn't go to the orphanage to find a baby. She already had 5 kids. She wasn't really looking to grow the family more, but she just knew the second she held him that she was hers. So she brought him home to us that day, and it's one of my most vivid memories from my childhood is this little baby of her holding him in front of us, and I took off his hat, and his hair just went like poof, it just puffed up, and we all just went into this giggle fit of this adorable little baby with his puffy hair, and so from that very second, we all knew that he was ours too. So Anawat was adopted, and now he goes by Patrick. Okay. And so he was my youngest brother for the longest time. So at this point now, there's 6 of us, 3 biological, 3 adopted, and at this point, you really stand out when you have that many children adopted in your family. And I think eventually we kind of got known around the area as the family that adopts kids.
Sure.
And so there were a number of other children that my parents fostered along the way, including my 2 older sisters, Margaret and Teresa, who at the time went by Pet and Ploy. They were going to be adopted by my aunt and uncle, but things fell through, and my aunt and uncle ended up adopting my other 2 cousins. But then eventually, Pet and Ploy came back into our lives, and my parents adopted them. And so I got 2 older sisters. And again, while all this is happening, I also had another sister, Claudia, who was 12 years old. She was about to phase out of the orphanage where she was staying in. Mm-hmm. And so my parents were approached and, said, would you be interested in adopting this girl? My parents said yes, took her home. And so I have 3 older adopted sisters now. So I started out as second oldest and somehow ended up being 5th oldest, which isn't really how it usually goes in family as families grow. You usually maintain your rank. I did not.
Yeah.
And then there's also my brother Dennis. And in his case, there was this priest who had been working in Cambodia and Thailand, found this little boy about 6 or 7 years old, literally begging on the streets, heard about our family, because again, we have so many children at this point that are adopted, and thought maybe they'd want him. So he brings Dennis to our house, and again, same kind of situation, like, oh, are you interested in this child? My parents, of course, said yes. Turns out he was about the same age as my younger brother, Stephen, even though he didn't have any type of birth certificates or anything like that. My parents got some testing done to determine his age. And so he and my brother Stephen have the same birthday now legally. Okay. So they've always been our twins, even though one's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy and the other one is Cambodian. And so, adding another younger brother into the mix. And then afterwards, we lived in Thailand for about 6 years, moved back to the U.S., My mom founded Mary's Shelter, which is a home for women in crisis pregnancies in Fredericksburg. And through that, my 2 youngest siblings, about 8 years ago, were adopted. So we have kids now ranging from 10 years old to 34 years old. 3 of us are biological. 9 of us are adopted. And that's my family.
Awesome.
So I can get into more specifics if you have questions.
Yeah. Can you go back? Can you tell us a little bit more about Mary's Shelter?
Oh, sure. So that is something that, again, my mom was always super active in pro-life ministry. Like I said, that brought her back to the church, and she worked in the orphanages in Thailand. So it was always something really near and dear to her heart. How it kind of all started, the short story is my mom was praying outside an abortion clinic, and a woman who was going into the clinic confronted my mom and said, well, what can you do to help me? And so it made my mom really step back and think, well, what am I doing to help? I mean, I'm showing up here and I'm praying, but what more can I do? Mm-hmm. So she and a few other people met and they formed Mary's Shelter, which started out in someone's basement, just being offered up to this one family so that they wouldn't need to abort their child. And it's grown into this amazing organization that owns a number of different homes in Fredericksburg's downtown area, and they've just helped countless women and children. And so how my 2 youngest siblings, Naya and Arius, kind of came to the picture is some of the women who go through there aren't always success stories. They have a lot of baggage with them, and so their mother lost the rights to her children, and it kind of turned into it was a temporary thing that it became a permanent solution just because of how much we bonded with these 2 children. Mm-hmm. And it just made sense that they would kind of join our family. But one thing I find interesting is that in not one single case did my parents actively go search to adopt a child. It was literally, starting out maybe just offering to foster children, right, or someone bringing a child to your door, like baby on the doorstep type deal.
Yeah. So. Well, it seems like in a lot of ways they clearly have a heart for children.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're good people.
You're a fan.
I'm a fan. I love them,
Awesome. So, yeah, one of the things you've said is kind of, your family said yes over and over again, but, it wasn't always perfect or easy. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges of adoption? Right. So, in your case.
Of course. I think that some people think, you waited long enough, you get your baby, you bring the baby home, and then it's just smooth sailing from there. But I think one of the things that people need to be aware of is that, being pro-life and saying yes to adoption doesn't always mean it's going to be an easy, perfect life. So if I take my brother Patrick, he's the one who was in the orphanage for children who were victims of HIV/AIDS. He was so sick for the first couple years of his life. He barely lived at our house. He lived in the hospital most of his, early infancy. Mm-hmm. And he was so sick, and my parents didn't even know at the time if he had HIV/AIDS or not, because the testing was a little bit, it wasn't really super advanced there, and they tested him kind of early when he still had his mother's antibodies in him.
Sure.
But eventually they did the testing again, and he came back negative for HIV/AIDS. But just the challenges of the first couple of years, my parents didn't know if when we moved back from Thailand, if they'd be bringing Patrick with us, like if he would survive this.
Sure.
But, they still said yes to this child because the life he was and the medical care he was able to receive was better than dying in an orphanage. I guess I know it's sad, but that's kind of the reality of it. So they kind of took on that struggle and that burden with my brother Patrick. And then there are other things too, like my older sisters that I mentioned. 3 of them, they were all adopted between the ages of around 11 to 12. And so with that, they brought in a ton of baggage. And I don't want to get into their personal lives, but
Sure.
Growing up with 3 older sisters that you didn't actually grow up with. There's struggles there, and while I have no problem, they're my sisters 100%. It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to have the same bonds all the time. But that's family. You're not gonna be
Right.
So there's some baggage there, and that was always kind of hard to deal with. But you get through it. And again, it's just kind of saying yes, even though it's going to be difficult. I think is the idea there.
Yeah. So, you obviously have a lot of experience with adoption. What would you tell a family considering adoption, or even, siblings?
Well,
the kids who are going to have, an adopted sibling.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, 1, I would thank them so much because I know how it changed my life. But 2, I would tell them to definitely approach it with a lot of prayer, and to also expect the unexpected, that it might not go the way you planned, and that it's going to take a lot of hard work and effort to incorporate this new life into your family, but that it's so worth it in the end.
Awesome. Well, since 1947, Catholic Charities has provided pregnancy and adoption support in the diocese. So if you are pregnant and looking for options for you and your baby, or you're a couple wanting to adopt, or a family needing post-adoption services, Catholic Charities can help. Visit ccda.net and click on Pregnancy and Adoption Services. All right, is there anything else you want to share?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, we could go through the names.
What? Yeah. Can you do a full list for us of all the siblings?
So it's Claudia, Teresa, Margaret, Aaron, me, Bridget, Stephanie, Stephen, Dennis, Mary, Patrick, Naya, and Arius. And if I missed any siblings, I'm really sorry. I don't love you less.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Bridget.
Thank you.
You're listening to Searching for More. If you enjoyed this podcast, please write a review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Also, make sure you follow the Diocese and the Arlington Catholic Herald on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to our YouTube channels for regular videos that inspire, educate, and inform about the Catholic faith in our diocesan community.